So last week, when we were finishing chapter 7, we got to the scene where Nicodemus speaks up on behalf of Jesus, says, "We don't condemn a man without hearing from him, do we?" And the other Jewish leaders say, "Are you a Galilean too?" and so on. And Nicodemus doesn't identify himself as a follower of Jesus. And then we'll pick up with a story here, beginning in the last verse of chapter 7. The famous story, controversial, often misinterpreted story, so there's some richness here. The woman caught in adultery, starting in chapter 7, verse 53. So each one went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he went to the temple complex again, and all the people were coming to him. He sat down and began to teach them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. "Teacher," they said to him, "this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" They asked this to trap him in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. Jesus stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they persisted in questioning him, he stood up and said to them, "The one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground. When they heard this, they left, one by one, starting with the older men. Only he was left with the woman in the center. When Jesus stood up, he said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she answered. "Neither do I condemn you," said Jesus. "Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore." Now, later on, some of you reading in your Bibles might have this passage in brackets or even in the margin of the text, questioning whether it was part of the original Bible. And we're going to discuss why that is later after we discuss the story. But this story is a difficult one. It's probably been poorly interpreted more than just about any story I can think of in the New Testament. So there's a saying, "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread." And so that's what I'll do today. But that's also, I think that's one of the values of teaching through a book. You don't get to skip over the stories you don't really want to teach. You don't get to skip over the tough ones. We'll examine some of the common poor interpretations before we discuss what I think is a better one. But the key question that reveals really what is a good interpretation and what is a poor one is, what exactly is the dilemma here? These Jewish leaders have had some people, probably not the leaders themselves, caught the woman in the act with some man, but somebody who did came to the leaders. So why didn't the leaders just handle it? What is their dilemma? A dilemma is when you've got two choices and they're both bad. In this case, you can punish her or not punish her. It must be that that's a dilemma and that they perceive, we're going to take this and dump it on Jesus and it's going to be his dilemma now. We're going to make him look bad. So you might say there's really three questions. Number one, what is their dilemma? Number two, why would it also be a dilemma for Jesus? Because if you come up with an explanation for why it's a dilemma for Jewish leaders that doesn't apply to Jesus, then it doesn't make sense of the story. It says they're trying to trap him. They're trying to get something they can use to accuse him. So it must be a dilemma for Jesus too. How? That's the second question. Once we've answered those two questions, we can answer the third question. How did Jesus escape the dilemma? If you're given two choices and they're both bad, it's pretty ingenious to be able to escape, in a sense. Right? How did Jesus do that? Well, it says they caught her in the very act. Well, we're going to get to all of that. But then at the end, Jesus says, go and sin no more. That kind of implies that she had sinned, but he was telling her no more. Okay. Okay. Well, he's got to answer a question, and they apparently think it's going to be pretty hard for him to answer. Now, he's going to escape that. Well, you can know, but it can still be a dilemma. If you give me a really bad choice, if you tell me choose A or B, even if I knew yesterday you were going to say that, if A and B are still both bad choices that make me look bad, how do I escape the dilemma? That's one of the things we're going to have to get to. How does Jesus escape the dilemma that they face? Well, we'll get to the specifics of his dilemma in a minute, but it's not just a matter of knowing in advance. It's a matter of, if you have two choices and both of them make you look bad, you can know a year in advance, and they still both make you look bad. So that's what we're going to get to here. One interpretation that we hear a lot of these days is what I would label as moral relativism. We're all sinners, so none of us can punish someone else. Well, if the first problem to that is this is very recent kind of postmodern thinking. It's not really credible that this is what people were thinking in the first century. It's not really credible that's what Jesus was thinking. It's not credible to me that they immediately caught on to that way of thinking and left. I think this is a very recent way of thinking in our society. The second problem is, if you followed that kind of logic, you could have no law and order. You couldn't punish anybody. You couldn't sit on a jury and vote to convict someone because you're not perfect. I mean, this would just be anarchy. But also, the key question, how does it explain why the Jewish leaders had a dilemma in the first place? They didn't believe that they had to be sinless in order to punish someone. That's not what the law of Moses says. They're concerned with what the law of Moses says about adultery. The law of Moses has all kinds of punishments for various things, and nowhere does it ever say the person doing the punishing has to be sinless, in which case there'd be no punishing. So that doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the story. But that's how people like to apply it today, because people today like to say, you can't judge me. You can't judge what I've done. Who are you? You're not perfect either. I don't have to be perfect. I know that murder is wrong, even though I'm not perfect. I'm not sinless. I know adultery is wrong. I know rape and kidnapping and arson and theft are wrong, and I can condemn those actions without being sinless. If you get caught, well, I can condemn those actions. I can only condemn them when I'm aware of them. I'm not God. I'm not omniscient.
What I'm saying is everyone's innocent if they're not caught.
Right.
So the Jewish leaders are not concerned with the woman and whether she was sinning or not. They're concerned with trapping Jesus into something.
They want Jesus to say something they can use against him. There's a feminist interpretation that I've heard a lot, which is, as pointed out, where is the man? Well, that's certainly a part of the story. The law of Moses, they don't even quote the law of Moses accurately. They quote the law of Moses as applying to the woman specifically. Well, it applies to anybody. It applies to the man she was having adultery with. So they didn't even cite the law correctly. And where is the man? Why isn't he being punished? Well, the thing is, even though that's an element of the story, I don't think that's the point that Jesus is making, because why didn't he just say so? If Jesus' whole point is, where's the man, why didn't Jesus say, where's the man? Saying, he who's without sin can cast the first stone is going off on a whole different tangent than, where's the man? If you want to say, where's the man, you say, where's the man? You know, that's not that complicated. That's just, you know, that's once again, the problem is this seems like a very modern interpretation. And it also doesn't explain what was the dilemma facing those Jewish leaders before they came to where Jesus was. Why didn't they punish the woman wherever they found her? What's their dilemma? This doesn't answer it. Why didn't they punish the woman and the man? What does Jesus have to do with it? What is their dilemma? And we'll answer that in a moment. I've even heard this one, that all of these men had committed adultery, and so Jesus made them feel like they can't cast the first stone. I find that really preposterous, because there is no record of looseness about the subject of adultery among the Jews in the first century, so that you could have a significant group and have 100% of them just happen to be adulterers. In fact, the whole story indicates they're taking adultery very seriously. That's part of their dilemma. And I don't think that explains their dilemma either. Because before, you know, if it were true, before Jesus ever convicted them with his words, why didn't they do something before they ever came to Jesus? What exactly is their dilemma? And the second question was, how would it also be Jesus' dilemma? Well, Jesus has never been accused of committing adultery. So that wouldn't explain why they would think that if they brought this woman to Jesus, it would be a dilemma for Jesus. If their only dilemma was that they themselves had committed adultery, why would they think this is a dilemma for Jesus? He's never been accused of that. I think the dilemma is something that comes from the interaction of the law of Moses and Roman law concerning capital punishment. Because the Roman Empire do you have a question? I'm sorry. Well, he does that all through the Gospels. But when this woman was brought to them, and Jesus wasn't even there yet, what was their dilemma? Right, that's their scheme. Their scheme is, we're going to trap Jesus and make him look bad. Right. Their scheme is to make Jesus look bad. But I don't think that when the woman was brought to them, Jesus isn't even there. They immediately recognize that they have a dilemma, and that's why they say, hey, let's go to Jesus and put this dilemma on him. So my question is, here they are, some local person has dragged this woman over to them and said, we caught this woman in adultery. Right at that moment, what is their dilemma? And I believe it's that the Romans don't allow them to carry out capital punishment. In Roman law, they have all this empire with all these different places, all these different religions. And for the most part, they don't allow different local authorities to carry out capital punishment with certain exceptions. And the exceptions vary from place to place. And for example, we know from Roman historical documents of what they took away from the Jews, any ability to carry out capital punishment a few years before Christ was born, with one exception. If someone came into the temple and desecrated the temple, they would allow the Jews to execute that person. Because the Romans recognized that, they wanted to keep the peace throughout the empire. They didn't want rebellions, they didn't want riots. And certain things are so serious that even though it's not their religion, they recognize there's going to be a riot if we don't do something about this. They were. When in Acts chapter 7, there was a mob that kind of spontaneously got so angry that they dragged Stephen out and stoned him. They're risking being accused of murder by the Romans. Now, I don't know that the Romans are aware that the Roman authorities are present. And that shows the kind of emotional mob mentality that was going on at the time of Stephen. Because they're taking a huge risk to stone Stephen. They can be accused by the Romans of murder. Yeah, Paul was standing there holding the coats and and there was this episode when Paul was taken out of town and stoned in the book of Acts almost to death by Jews. That was still in the Roman Empire. They weren't allowed to do that either. So, it's not that people never break the law. I'm just saying here's what the Roman law is. There's recorded a case of a Roman soldier who desecrated a copy of the Jewish scriptures, part of the scripture that was taken from a synagogue. And the Romans themselves executed their own soldier to keep the peace because they recognize, they're not really concerned with justice. There's a difference between law and order and justice. The Romans were concerned with order. You had to maintain order in the empire. You don't want rebellions. You don't want, riots and so on. You see this in Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate doesn't know what's going on with this accusation against Jesus. He doesn't really care. He says, this sounds like a Jewish religious dispute. I don't care about your religious disputes. But when the Jewish crowd makes him feel like there's about to be a riot, then he gets weak. Then he wants to give in. Because if you're the governor and the word gets back to Rome that you're not keeping things under control, that you're allowing rebellions and riots to happen because of the way you're governing, you'll be removed as governor. So Pilate wasn't concerned, what is the justice of the situation? He said out loud, I find no fault in this man. He's not concerned with justice, but he doesn't want to riot. And so the very limited exceptions where the Romans recognized the Jewish religion and would actually carry out an execution are because they don't want a riot or a rebellion. But otherwise, Roman law says adultery is not a criminal matter like it is in the law of Moses. Adultery is a civil matter. It can be grounds for divorce. But that's a civil matter. You don't go to jail, you don't get flogged, you don't get executed. Adultery under Roman law was a civil matter, like it would be under our law today. They didn't take people and execute them for adultery in the Roman Empire. Okay? So we have a conflict there between the law of Moses. And we can see in the when the Jews are before Pilate, and Pilate says, well, why don't you take Jesus and deal with him? Chapter 18, verse 31, the Jews say, we cannot execute him. We don't have the authority to execute him. And then Pilate realizes, oh, they're asking me to execute him. This is getting deeper here. But they say out loud what we also know to be true from historical documents outside the Bible. They weren't allowed to execute. So what they did to Stephen in Acts 7 was against Roman law. It was a mob on spur of the moment that broke the law. So what's their dilemma? Well, they can ignore the law of Moses concerning the punishment for adultery. But if they do that, how do people look at them as leaders? They can follow the law of Moses and carry out an execution, and then what happens? If the Roman authorities find out about it, they get accused of murder. So yeah, they have a dilemma. They've got two choices, both of them really bad. Ignore the law of Moses or risk being arrested, prosecuted for murder by the Romans. Which of those two choices do they want? Well, they don't want either of those two choices. And it would be the same dilemma for Jesus. They want to trap Jesus. They want Jesus to either say, forget the law of Moses, let her go. And then what will they do? They'll go around telling all of Jesus' followers, you know what Jesus said? You know what attitude he took towards the law? Or Jesus could say, okay, let's execute her. And then what could they do? They can go to the Roman authorities and say, Jesus is telling us to execute this woman, which we don't have right to do under your law. They could get Jesus arrested right now, well before he intends to finish his ministry. So their dilemma applies perfectly to Jesus too. So when they found themselves caught in a dilemma, they said, let's dump this dilemma on Jesus. And whatever he chooses, we've got him. We've nailed him. You know, we are going to discredit him with either the Roman authorities or his own followers. And so, how can Jesus escape the dilemma? What's going on here when he says, let the one without sin cast the first stone? This is very foreign to us because we're so individualistic, but the Jews recognized that they were rewarded and punished collectively as the chosen people of God. Because of their collective sin in Old Testament times, primarily idolatry, following after pagan gods in addition to their own God, they suffered captivity. The northern tribes were carried off to Assyrian captivity. After the Assyrian Empire was replaced by the Babylonian Empire, more than 100 years later, the southern tribes of Judah around Jerusalem were carried off in the Babylonian captivity, starting in 586 BC. Then the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Medes and Persians Empire, and then Alexander the Great conquered the Medes and Persians, so it became Greek, and that's why the Greek language is used throughout this area. And then after Alexander died, eventually the Romans took over what was most of Alexander's empire. That's why they've got these Gentiles tromping around with their unclean feet in the promised land. That's why they're being ruled by Gentiles. That's why Gentiles are choosing the Sadducees, choosing who's in charge of the temple even. These Gentiles are ruling over them, which is totally repugnant to them. But why is it? Why are the Gentiles ruling over them? Well, it's their own fault. Now, today we would say it's not our fault. It's 600 years ago somebody's fault. Right? But they recognized they were the people of God, and that collective reward fell upon the people of God even when some of them were unrighteous, and collective punishment fell upon them even when some of them were righteous. Think about Daniel and his friends in the book of Daniel, carried off to Babylon. They were said to be righteous young men, followers of God. From our individualistic perspective, we'd say, well, they didn't deserve to be carted off to captivity with everybody else, right? They weren't idolatrous. But that's the way it goes when you're a nation. And not be killed in the first place, you know. When you're a nation, things happen to the whole nation. And that includes people who were responsible and people who were not. And in some sense, the Jews perceived that everyone's responsible. Everyone's responsible who didn't speak up when they saw other people committing idolatry and so on. You know. So they had a collective concept, and they understood that it was their sin that creates their dilemma. Their sin has created a situation in which they cannot carry out their own law. And these scribes and Pharisees recognized that. In fact, it was preached upon by rabbis back then all the time. This is our punishment from God, having these Gentiles here ruling over us. This is our punishment for our sin. And so part of their punishment is they get to live under Roman law, where Romans decide everything and Romans rule the courts and so on. And they don't get to carry out their own law. And since this was something that was taught all the time, I think that those Jewish leaders, these scribes and Pharisees, when they first had this woman brought to them, immediately recognized their dilemma. They immediately recognized, we're supposed to do an execution, and we can't. I don't think it was a subtle thing to them, because it was something that they were preaching out constantly. We need to pray that God will deliver us, but we can't complain. It's our own fault that we're in this situation. So what Jesus is saying is, if you have no sin, go ahead and cast the first stone, because then it's not your fault. You're not part of the sin of the nation as a whole, if you're a sinless person. If you're a sinless person, you could stand back and say, I'm not responsible for the situation we're in with the Romans. I'm sinless. No dilemma for me. But, of course, which of them says, okay, that I qualify, I'm sinless, so I share no guilt? Well, obviously none of them. None of them qualify for that. Now, why is it that many of your study Bibles will have it in brackets and will say, many earliest manuscripts don't have this passage here? Some Bibles will even put it in the margin. Well, it's true that the earliest manuscript that has this story in this location here in John is in about 400 AD. But there were numerous Christian authors before that who referred to the story, taught the story, discussed how to teach the story, and so on. So it definitely goes, it's misleading to make it sound like it just popped up in 400 AD. That's not the case. Okay, we have early Christian references. Jerome translated the Bible from Greek into Latin in about 380 to 390 AD. And when he wrote in his letters about his decisions in translating, he said he included this story because he had it in front of him in many manuscripts. And Augustine, North African Christian leader, what's now Algeria, was kind of a big critic of Jerome's translation and wrote a lot of things critical of Jerome's translation, but he accepted this decision because he also had manuscripts. He knew the story. He had taught it. Ambrose, also called Ambrose of Milan, about 375 AD, wrote about the story, and he advised what he called unskilled ministers, just don't teach it. If you try to teach it, you're in a minefield. You're going to create confusion if you teach this story. And the worry was people are going to hear the story and think, oh, you can do whatever sin you want, and then you just get forgiven later. Kind of a cheap grace concept that we would say today. And it shows you that how different it was. It's not like everybody has a printed Bible they can run home and read on their own. If the church leader said, don't teach a certain story, then they might not never hear that story in those days. And I think that this fear was partly based on losing touch with this Jewish first century context. There's a lot of reading that I've done in the ancient church fathers that even in the 2nd century, they were losing touch with the Jewishness of certain aspects of the New Testament. Because once the Jews kicked all the Christians out of the synagogues in the 1st century, the church became almost exclusively a Gentile phenomenon. There were very few Jewish converts after about, what we read in the New Testament, the book of Acts. You get into 150 AD, 180 AD, everybody there was a Gentile background. Jews and Christians were very hard split by that time. And so the explanation of what was going on is a very 1st century Jews and Romans explanation. And I think that by 400 AD, 300 and something AD, they'd lost sight of that. They lost understanding of that. And so I think early Christian scribes didn't know what to do with the story, didn't know if they were supposed to copy it. And I think early Christian scribes did several different things based on the manuscripts. There are manuscripts where this story is at the end of the Gospel of John. Like, I didn't want to totally get rid of it. I'm just going to put it here at the end. It's also found at the end of the Gospel of Luke in other manuscripts. So I think what this story demonstrates, it's a difficult story for people. And so the scribes weren't sure what to do with it. And people were being told not to preach it. So it got omitted. And in fact, many scholars identify the language as the language of Luke. So the fact that it appears at the end of Luke might be actually a good indication that it came from Luke. And that involves looking at Greek, but one thing you can actually see yourself in English. This phrase, the scribes and the Pharisees, that's all over the book of Luke. That's his phrase for the Jewish leaders. John's phrase is often just the Jews, we talked about last week. This is the only place in the Gospel of John where the phrase, the scribes and the Pharisees, occurs. That's not what John said, generally. So this is the orphan passage that bounces around from manuscript to manuscript because people were afraid of how it would be interpreted and how it would be used. And would it be used to justify, just go sin and then be forgiven later? Just go commit adultery and then be forgiven later or something. And they were so worried about that it became the orphaned passage that was ignored. But it reappeared in manuscripts because people recognized it as a legitimate first century story. They just didn't know where to put it or what to do with it. Does it belong at this exact location in John? Doubtful. Is it an authentic story that has the flavor of something that would really happen in Jesus' lifetime? Yes. This dilemma is very first century and was beyond the understanding of people in the 3rd and 4th centuries. It has the flavor of authenticity, but where exactly does it go? Don't know. So, anyway, thank you for your time.